So today we are talking about Sarah, whose name before it was Sarah was Sarai, like Abraham. She had a name change. You guys may remember she is Abraham's wife. We say wife, but it's not like they had like marriage ceremonies back then. Um, so uh, this is way back in the day, remember? And that's going to be important when we talk about Hagar. That really just kind of like women were like given to men, and it's complicated. So if you guys remember, Abraham followed God across the world, right? As far as he knew, to this new land of Canaan. And God had promised Abraham he would have as many descendants as there are stars in the sky. But at this point, does Abraham have any children? No, he has no children. So he's old and his wife is old. And when we first meet Sarah, like I said, her name is Sarai. They have no kids. They're living in Ur, and then they're going to travel to Canaan. Hannah says he makes a mistake. Yeah, Abraham does make a mistake. He is human. Lots of mistakes are made. So God had promised Abraham a child, particularly a son. So let's go to our first reading. Genesis 16, 1 through 3. Genesis 16, 1 through 3. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as wife. So they move from Ur to like Haran to then Canaan. This is very far away. We already talked about this. At one point they did go to Egypt. That's probably where they got Hagar. They could have gotten her somewhere else. She is a slave. They own her. She is certainly not the only person Abraham owns. He is very much a man of his time, and had slaves. This is not cool, obviously. So Sarai is Abram's wife. We see here that they've already been in Canaan for 10 years. So it's been a long time since God made that promise. He made them a promise that they would have a son. And it hasn't happened. And so Sarah's kind of like, I'm old. I'm not going to have kids at this point. So what other ways can we make God's promise come to fruition? Is this a lack of faith, or does she just think she needs to make some sort of effort? Usually people talk about it as lack of faith. But I think it could be. I think it could also be one of those scenarios where she's like, well, God said we were going to have kids, but, God also gave us brains to use. So I'm using my brain to do it this way. And in her world, that involves using her slave. Because the way it sort of worked is that she owns Hagar, right? And if Hagar has Abraham's child, it kind of counts as her child. I say kind of because in these Old Testament stories where this happens, we never really see the woman who's using the slave to have a child embrace that child as their own. So I think there's still a removal. A child via a slave is better than no child at all, but it is not what Sarah would normally want. And does Hagar have any choice in any of this? No, she's a slave. So basically one day she's minding her own business and her master, Sarah, comes to her and is like, I need you to sleep with my husband to have a son. This seems like a terrible plan, first off. And secondly, Hagar literally has no choice. So this is literally rape. She can't say no. She has nothing she can do to stop this from happening. The reasons from Hagar's perspective this would be a bad decision are: one, what if she sleeps with Abram and then he thinks he likes her better than Sarah and then starts treating Sarah poorly, and then Sarah's going to treat her poorly. Like this could all just go terribly. What if she doesn't have a kid? What if she too is infertile? What if she has a daughter? And then what if she does have a son and then things don't go according to Sarah's plan? There is literally no good scenario for Hagar in this. I guess the best thing that could happen for Hagar is that Abram could think he falls in love with her and decide to free her and or recognize her child as his primary heir and give that child everything. That is the best case scenario. But then you're still going to have Sarah, who wouldn't be happy about that. Hannah, how did they know they were infertile back then? So with Sarah, she knew she was infertile because she was old. With Sarah, we're basically looking at a woman who is past her childbearing years. So through her entire youth and childbearing years, when she was married to Abram, she had no children. And then now she's probably post-menopause, which means she can't have children anymore, short of a miracle. And so she is just like, she knows she's infertile. How would Hagar know she's infertile? She doesn't. But the other thing is, they really don't know if they're infertile. So a lot of times, the men would blame the women for being infertile. And it could definitely have been a problem on the man's part. I mean, if you look at like Henry VIII, right? What are the odds that he had 6 wives who had a really hard time getting pregnant? Who's the common denominator here? It's Henry VIII, right? So the men often blamed the women when we actually had no idea if it was the women's fault or not. Now, in a Rachel and Leah situation, clearly it's Rachel who had trouble bearing children because Leah was also married to Jacob and she had a lot of children. But in this scenario, we don't actually know that it was Sarah who was infertile all these years. They couldn't have known that. Though, as we do see, Abram does get Hagar pregnant. So, really, there's no way to know. There's no way to know if you're infertile or you're just have really bad timing or whatever. There's no way. There was no way for them to know. So, yeah. So most people, when they read this story, they see this as a lack of faith on Sarah's part. They're like, look how unfaithful Sarah was. That she, pulled in Hagar. But we forget Abram had a big part in this too. Abram didn't have to sleep with Hagar. He could have been like, no, Sarah, we're going to trust God. Right? He could have done that. But instead, he too was like, okay, cool. Oh, whatever. So this is just as much a lack of faith on Abram's part as it is on Sarah's. If it is a lack of faith, or if it's just one of those situations where they're just like, maybe God wants me to take control of this scenario. Maybe that's how they're rationalizing it. So now we have our family tree that we had last week, right? So Abram's wife is Sarai. But now he also has Hagar. So this kind of goes back to this idea of sometimes in the Bible, we translate things as wife versus concubine. And so people will be like, Sarah is a wife and Hagar is a concubine. And the difference that we would say modernly is that a wife is like someone who is like fully your partner. The partner is the wrong word because they didn't really view wives as partners. But she's like a better status of wife than a concubine is what we would say, right? Though a concubine is still kind of a wife. But usually an heir would have to come from a wife and not a concubine is what we would say and what other cultures would say. But if you look at the Hebrew, there's actually no word for wife. It's really just like Sarah was Abraham's woman, And then Hagar becomes one of Abraham's women. It's just that Hagar is a slave. So that doesn't necessitate that Hagar's child would be a slave. Not all slavery worked like American slavery, where if you were a slave, your child was a slave, and your child's child was a slave forever and ever and ever. And if Abraham recognizes Ishmael as his heir, then Ishmael is no longer a slave. Really, it's up to Abraham of how he wants to recognize Ishmael. But with Hagar, she doesn't get freed in this scenario. Mike says from Google, a woman who lives with a man but has a lower status than a wife or wives. Yeah, so that is the Google definition of the concubine. But the Hebrew doesn't really have a difference between the two of them, other than Hagar is owned by Abram and Sarah. So Hagar is subservient to Sarah because Sarah can tell her what to do. And so can Abram, and she has no choice. Not that Sarah has a lot of choice, because remember, this is a patriarchal society. Sarah is not a slave, so she is in a better position than Hagar, but Abraham still gets to tell Sarah what to do. And Sarah doesn't really get much of a choice in that. When Abraham said we're moving to Canaan, Sarah didn't get a choice. So what we're going to see is one of these scenarios where you have a person who is kind of oppressed, and Sarah, right? She's a second-class citizen in her society, who then, in her angst, further oppresses the person below her. It happens all the time. So keep going. Genesis 16, 4 through 6. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarah said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarah, "Your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarah dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. There's so much wrong here. Guys, slavery is wrong. Forcing someone to have a child is wrong. Everything about this scenario is wrong. So Abraham sleeps with Hagar. She conceives. So she is pregnant. When she knows she is pregnant, she basically kind of starts to lord it over Sarah, is what the Bible says. So this can be like one of two things here. This can literally be Hagar is like, look, I was able to deliver for your husband what you haven't been able to. Why are you his wife? Shouldn't I be the head honcho woman? What good are you? Hagar could totally have been doing that, and it probably wouldn't have been that hard for this kind of stuff to go to her head. But the other thing that it could have been is it just could have been the mere sight of Hagar being pregnant could have caused Sarah distress. Sarah has dealt with infertility her entire life. Just seeing Hagar walking around pregnant, even though this was Sarah's plan, just seeing her could have hurt Sarah. And even if Hagar wasn't intending to do contempt, Hagar could have been like, Sarah asks Hagar to do something, and Hagar's like, I don't know if I can do that. My back hurts because, I'm pregnant. And Sarah would be like, how dare you? Right? We don't know. It could be either way. It could be a mixture of the two. We also don't know how young Hagar is. Hagar could be like 16 and Sarah is much older than that. And so there's some age differential. Was Abram showing Hagar preference because she was pregnant? There's a lot that could be going on here. And so I generally think that everyone was probably in the wrong, but if I'm going to give a benefit of the doubt to anyone in this situation, it's going to be Hagar. She is a slave who was forced into a scenario and, she didn't want to be pregnant. She didn't want to be Abraham's wife. Here she is. So Sarah is pissed that Hagar is pregnant and treating her with contempt, whatever that means. And she basically goes to Abram and she's like, this is your fault. Every wrong that's being done to me by Hagar, it should be done to you. I gave her to you, and now she is looking at me with contempt. May God judge between the two of us, Abraham. This is your fault. I mean, is it Abraham's fault? Sort of. Yeah, I mean, he could have said no at any point. But Sarah was the master. She created this plan. And then Abram is the patriarch of this family. He lives in a society where he can be like, let me sit you down and I will deal justice, right? That is his job. But instead of doing that, he sees Sarah is angry and that, she doesn't like Hagar anymore. And instead of being like, hey, Sarah, this was your plan, and Hagar is carrying our child, Sarah, that's how we're viewing this, right? So maybe we should, treat her well while she's pregnant so the pregnancy goes well, and then after that, we'll figure it out or whatever. No, instead he's just like, she's your slave, Sarah, do whatever you want. Yeah, he just completely washes his hands of this whole scenario. A scenario that he is deeply involved in. Hagar is carrying his child. His heir. Hagar is one of his women. Hagar, ultimately, Abram owns everybody. So instead he's like, he sees Sarah as angry and he's basically like, why don't you just take your anger out on your slave, Sarah? Everyone needs therapy. That's everyone. So Sarah turns around and deals harshly with Hagar, which, remember, Hagar is a slave. Corporal punishment is very much a thing with slaves. So I wouldn't be surprised if Sarah starts, hitting Hagar, giving her the worst jobs that hurt her, or just starts like mocking her at every turn. Like this could be anything. And so Hagar runs away. Let's go to the next section. Genesis 16, 7 through 12. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am running away from my mistress Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all of his kin. I need some water. So Hagar runs away, and an angel comes to her, and he says, Hagar, what are you doing? And she's like, I am running away. I am done with those people. I have to leave. And the angel tells her to go back. This seems really harsh to us. Hagar is a slave, and God is telling her to go back. But you guys are we're forgetting what society was like back then. Hagar is a probably young, pregnant woman, a slave, an Egyptian in a Canaanite land. No one is going to treat her well who finds her. Jaron said, wild ass of a man. I thought they did not cuss. Nobody ever said that people in the Bible don't cuss. Cussing's not written down. We don't have a lot of their bad words. What this says is a wild donkey of a man. He will be like a wild donkey. So basically think of it like an untamed horse, right? A bucking bronco, right? That would probably be a better translation for our modern eyes. If they were like, you are a wild bronco of a man, right? But we're going to get to that. So the angel tells her to return. If Hagar had remained out there, she probably would have ended up in a worse situation. People in this time period did not deal well with widows, which she would kind of be viewed as, and orphans. People aren't like now, where they were like, oh, we want to adopt orphans. Back then, people were like, feeding myself is hard enough. I'm not going to feed somebody else's kid. So while a woman they might take in because they could view her as an asset, a pregnant woman, they're not going to have anything to do with her. Really, the only people who have any obligation to Hagar are Sarah and Abraham. The only people who will take care of her are Sarah and Abraham. And in this ancient patriarchal world, she really doesn't have much power on her own. It's not like today where you can move out, get a job, and start to live your life. She has none of that power. So while it seems harsh to us that the angel sends her back, and I'm sure it felt harsh to her, I'm sure she was like, I can't go back there. This is really the only way for her to be able to have her child, for her child to be born, and for them to be safe and taken care of. Even if it's not the best safety or the best taken care of, it's still better than death, would kind of, I think, be how the angel is looking at it, or God is. But God is not sending her back just to be like, return and submit to her and your life's going to suck and that's life. That's not how he's sending her back. He's saying he gives her a promise. God gives Hagar the same promise she gives Abraham. I will greatly multiply your offspring so that they cannot be counted for a multitude. That she will have so many offspring. But then he goes on, and it's a little more depressing. Because he's like, you will conceive and have a son. Great. She's like, this is great news. Sons are how you get taken care of. Sons are great, right? In the ancient world. And then he's like, but everyone's going to be against your son, Hagar. Now, I'm sure Hagar's like, sure, what else is new? Everyone's against me. I am not surprised everyone is against my son. And we're going to kind of talk about Ishmael more next week. He will live at odds with his kin. He will never be accepted. And we're going to see that more. Mike said, this is just like 2020. All bad news. I would say it's not all bad news because having a son is good news. But the rest of it does seem like bad news. Genesis 16:13 through 16. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi." For she said, "Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him?" Therefore the well was called Bir Lahoi Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So what's interesting about this is there aren't a lot of people in the Old Testament who give God a name. In fact, if I remember correctly, Hagar is the only one. There are people who say, God, you are like my father, or you are like a provider, or you are like this. Moses asks God for a name, but Hagar names God. She says, "You are El Roi." Basically it's the God who sees, that she has been seen by God, that she was being seen by nobody. She is just a slave, and she ran away, and God saw her, and he saw her pain, and he came for her, that she is still important, even though she is literally the lowest of the low. She is a slave girl. That's like a nobody, and God saw her, and this I think says a lot about our God and how we should view him, is that our God sees everyone, even the lowest of the low. And we're going to see that again and again in the Old Testament, that God kind of flips the script on a lot of people, and when he should be looking, you would think, like, sure, Abraham, he's a rich, well-off man, that's exactly the kind of guy God should love, right? But God doesn't let Hagar just slip through the cracks. He comes for her too. God cares for every one of them, from Abraham to Hagar. So Hagar does bear Ishmael, who is Abram's son. And as you can see, Abram is very old when this happens. He's like 86. Sarah is like 10 years younger than Abraham, I think. And Hagar would be much, much younger, like we said. So now the family tree continues. We have Abraham and his secondary wife, Hagar, and their child, Ishmael. Genesis 18:9 through 14. I need context for this. Sorry, we're backing up. Hannah, I just think so weird about age differences. Yeah. The ancient world was very different from the world of today. But yeah, it's creepy. I mean, there's so many layers of creepiness between Abraham and Hagar, because not only is she so much younger than him, but she is literally a slave. So once again, it's basically rape. It is rape, right? So, keep going. We're supposed to be talking about Sarah, not just Hagar. So they're still living in Canaan. They're raising Ishmael. Ishmael is basically the heir apparent for a long time. And we're going to talk about this again next week. But skipping ahead, in Sarah's story, God had promised Abraham a son by Sarah. He very specifically promised it by Sarah. And so in chapter 18, God appears to Abraham in the form of 3 visitors. And at this point, I believe he is Abraham, and her name has been changed to Sarah. They are probably angels of God, but Abraham doesn't know that when these 3 visitors arrive. And I definitely don't think Sarah knew that. Hannah said, I'm so weird thinking my mom starting elementary school when your dad started middle school. That's not even that big of an age difference, right? That's like 6 years. But yeah, Trevor and I are 4 years apart in age. So when I was starting 9th grade, Trevor was starting college. But we did not meet until I was 28. When you're little, those age differences are huge, right? The difference between a freshman in high school and a freshman in college is insurmountable. A freshman, people should not be dating with that age difference. It is wrong. A freshman in college is probably trying to take advantage of a freshman in high school. But once you're older, that age difference isn't that much. What's the age difference? What's the difference between being 60 and 64, right? It's really about stages of life. And if your stages of life kind of match. 14 to 18 is huge. 60 to 64 isn't. When Trevor and I met, it was like, maybe I was 27. I don't remember. Trevor probably remembers better. We met in 2014. Math. We were at the same stage in life that is very similar. When you're even older, like sometimes you'll have someone who's like 70, marry someone who's 60. That's not that big of an age difference at that point, but 20 versus 30 is a huge age difference, right? So the age thing, really, you don't want to be in one of these situations like Abraham and Hagar, right? Where Abraham is so much older than her. He is clearly taking advantage of her. It is clearly like a bad scenario, right? All right, but moving on to Sarah. So Sarah was promised a child. So we have these 3 visitors, and that's the they in this first section. So Genesis 18:9 through 14. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' If is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son. So Abraham's talking to these three visitors. And one of the visitors is like, where's your wife? And he's like, oh, she's in the tent. And that's not like being in a house, right? A tent is literally a cloth. So Sarah can hear everything that's happening in the tent. I don't know why she's in the tent. She just is chilling, resting. I don't know. And the angel says, well, next time I return, your wife's going to have a son. Now, Sarah's listening. It says clearly here that she is very old, that she is postmenopausal, so she can't have children anymore. So when she hears this, she's like, have a kid. These visitors are crazy. And the angel of the Lord responds, why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too wonderful for God? When I return, Sarah will have a son. Now we can be like, of course we know God's capable of anything like that. But you have to remember, there was no Old Testament when Sarah and Abraham followed God. There was no Jesus when Abraham and Sarah followed God. Like now, we have the story of the virgin birth, right? Mary gave birth to Jesus. There was no man involved, right? That is a miracle. We have multiple stories in the Old Testament about God enabling people who are infertile or who have never had a child to have a child. So Sarah and Abraham, in a lot of ways, they're really still getting to know God. They trust him. They followed him across the world, but they don't necessarily know everything about him, right? They don't have a whole book describing who God is to them. So they are learning about God directly through their experience. And they also, once again, don't know that these guys visiting them are angels of God. So when just this random guy that they're giving hospitality to is like, who hasn't seen Sarah, right? So she's probably sitting in her tent thinking, oh, Abraham's entertaining these visitors. They haven't seen me. So when they're like, oh, I'm sure your wife's going to have a son, she's probably sitting there thinking, they probably think I'm like 25. But I'm not. I'm like 1,000,000 years old. How silly of these young men who have come into our basically village, right? Because it's all their people and stuff, our home, and to think that I'm going to have a kid. There's no way that's going to happen. But the angel is like, she shouldn't laugh. Nothing's too wonderful for God. God's going to do it. And I tell you, when I come back, she will have a son. So, Genesis 21, 1-7. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have ever said to Abraham that Sarah will nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So this is kind of like a tie back, the laughter tie. Sarah laughed at the angels. And now she's like, laughter as in joy. God has brought her joy, right? So it says God dealt with Sarah as he said he would and as he promised. So once again, this makes clear God didn't just make Abraham a promise. He's not just dealing with the men, right? He made Sarah a promise too. He promised her he would give her a son. And God delivers on that promise. He delivers promises, not just to the men, but also to the women. So Sarah has a son. They name him Isaac, which I believe they say means laughter, because that goes back to Sarah saying about the laughter. And Abraham is 100 years old, is what it says. OMG. Like, even if you don't think Abraham's 100 years old in one of our ways of counting years, because remember, the calendar has changed. So we could say 100. Bye, Mike. Have fun at the 11 o'clock service. So even if we say like their years might have been slightly off, Abraham is still very clearly old. He was probably 80 plus, and here he is with a kid. I wouldn't want to raise a kid when I'm 100. No, ain't nobody got energy for that. Um, but Sarah says God has brought laughter for her. Everyone who hears will laugh with her. Everyone will have this joy that she who is without a child for her whole life now has a son. Hannah has to go too. Bye, Hannah. Have fun at church. So now she is happy. We're actually almost done. And God has delivered this promise. So next week, we're going to see how this promise of Isaac, how this works out for Ishmael and Hagar. And we're going to talk about Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac. And we're going to see that, you know, things are not good in the house of Abraham. And they're not good for everybody. But things are good for Sarah in this moment. So let's leave her with her happily ever after at this moment. Or happily ever for now. And next week we'll come back and see what exactly is going to go down with all of that. Because Ishmael has been raised as the heir. And now we have Isaac. So, and I do want to make a point that Sarah, who had kind of a disbelief, she didn't believe God would give her a son, right? She thought she had to use other means to give Abraham an heir. She thought she needed to pull Hagar in. She thought she needed to use her own machinations. And even though she doubted, and even though she did things that weren't necessarily what God wanted for her, God still delivered on his promise. His promise was not contingent on her behavior. So despite her bad behavior and disbelief, God still blessed her with Isaac. So that's today's lesson. That is the end. So family tree. I forgot that. So we now have Ishmael and Isaac. Dun, dun, dun. And we'll see how that goes.